Okay then my friends, so throughout this chapter we've looked at a lot of different control flow techniques, and in each one of those different techniques we've seen code blocks like this, curly braces, and those code blocks are just little sections of code that run when something is true or some condition is met, right? So now we know what code blocks are. One last thing I want to talk about in this chapter is block level scope with variables. And by the word scope, I mean the area in which a variable value is relevant. So I already have this if statement right here. What I'm also going to do is create a variable. So I'm going to say let age equal to 30. Now then, if I define a variable using let or const in the root of the document, meaning not inside any code block, it's in the root of the document up here, then that will have global scope. And that means it can be accessed anywhere in the file if I want to use it. So it could be accessed inside this code block. It could also be accessed outside this code block. So let's just down here console.log outside code block, just to let us know where this is, and then we're going to output age. Okay, and then we're also going to do the same thing, but we're going to do that inside the code block. So let's paste this inside here, and I'm going to say inside first code block and output the age there as well. So I'm just showing you this to demonstrate that we can access this variable which has global scope outside of the code block and also inside anywhere in the file because it has that global scope. So if I save it, we can see that we get that value in both cases. Okay, so that is global scope. Now I can also change that variable inside here. So I could say now age is equal to 40 inside here, and that is going to access this global scope variable, change it to 40, and then output it here and here. So if I save it and preview, we can see that now it's 40 in both cases because we change it here first before we output it anywhere. Now then, what if I try to redefine age outside here? So if I say let age equal to 50. So I'm trying to redefine the variable again. I'm not just trying to overwrite it by saying age is equal to 50 now. I'm trying to completely redefine it by saying let age equal 50. Now, it's not going to let me do this. It's already been declared, and I can't do this because it's in the same scope. Okay? Now then, what if inside the code block I try to say let age equal 40? Well, what's going to happen there because I'm trying to redefine it again? Well, if I save it, let's preview the results. So we see inside the first code block we get 40 for the age, and outside the code block 30. So firstly, most importantly, we don't get an error. So we are allowed to do this. We're allowed to redefine the variable inside a code block even though it's got the same name. Now secondly, it's only creating age equal 40 inside this code block right here. Outside, age still refers to this, but inside, age refers to this. So what this is doing here is creating a local scope for this variable age inside this code block. If I just use age, then it refers to the global variable that's already been defined. But if I redefine it, what it does is recreate this variable, but it gives it local scope. Now, we can only access this version of age inside this code block. So let me try something else. I'm going to say let name equal to Sean. And what I'm going to do is output age and name here, and age and name here. Let's see what happens. Save it and preview. And we see Sean here, but we don't see it outside the code block. And that's again because we're creating this variable inside the code block. We're giving it a local scope, meaning the scope of this variable is only valid inside this code block because we define it inside here. We're not defining it outside here with root level scope or global scope. So if we define something in a code block, it only has that scope and we can't access it outside of that code block. Does that make sense? Okay, this is also true for nested code blocks. And by that I mean if we had some other if check in here, So we'll just say if true so that it does fire. This is a nested code block. We have a code block nested in another block. Now inside this code block, what if I try to access age? Let me console.log first of all, and we'll say inside second code block, and spell this correctly, we'll output age. So what value do you think we're going to get here? Because we've defined it here, but we've also defined it here locally. If we save it and preview, we can see inside the second code block, we get 40, which is the value we defined in here. So what it's doing is taking the most recently defined value. So the value whose scope is most immediate outside of this code block. If this wasn't here, then it would take this value. I can demo that, save it, and we can see 30. But because we've redefined it inside this code block, and this code block right here is all of here, this is the scope of this variable now, all of this code block, including this stuff in here, it means that inside this code block, when we use age, it gets this value. Okay then, so what if I try to say then, let age equal to 50 inside this code block? Well, again, we're creating a new variable with local scope, but this scope is only valid inside here. So we're not overwriting this one right here, we're creating a new local one with local scope inside just this code block. So if I save it now and preview, then we should see 50 inside the second code block, okay? Now, so far we've just used let, but the same would be true if we used const. So let me just now change all of these to const. I'm just going to place my cursor in front of all of those and change them all to const and save it. And we're going to see exactly the same results. Obviously, we can't change constants, so we couldn't later on say something like age is now equal to 35, because once we define a constant, we can't change them. But the same rules of scope apply to const as they do to let variables. So this idea of block scope is one of the main advantages of using let and const instead of the older var keyword, because when we make a variable using var, it ignores block scope. So we could have a variable defined, down here. Let's just say var test is equal to hello, and we can then access that outside down here. So we could say test, and that would work. So even though it's defined inside this code block, it's not given block scope, whereas these things are once we create them, okay? So that is one of the main advantages of using let and const, because a lot of the time it's useful to declare a variable that is only used inside a code block. It's much better to use let and const instead of var where possible. So this idea of block scope might seem strange at first, and even probably could go straight over your head, but do watch the video a couple of times over if you're struggling, just to understand at least the basics of block scope, because it will definitely benefit you going forward.